create a comprehensive cinematic geopolitical narration following your exact specifications, with voice-over commands embedded throughout and advanced punctuation for rhythm. A vessel approaches a junction, not a crossroads on land, but a corridor carved through Earth, 48 miles of engineered passage where two oceans meet without touching. The crew does not calculate arrival in miles. They calculate in queue position, in vessel count, in the incremental movement of steel hulls waiting for permission to proceed, permission that is granted elsewhere by systems operating beyond their view. Time in this context becomes currency, not the time measured by clocks, but the time measured by displacement, the difference between a 2-week voyage around an entire continent and a 10-hour transit through controlled water. That difference is not merely logistical, it is not merely economic, it is the physical manifestation of leverage, and leverage, when it involves the movement of goods, energy, and military assets worth trillions annually, does not remain theoretical for long. There exists between the Atlantic and Pacific a narrow mechanism. It was not placed there by nature, it was excavated, constructed, optimized over decades of labor that cost thousands of lives and reshaped regional geography. When it became operational, it did not simply shorten distances, it redefined what distance meant. It created a dependency structure so fundamental to global commerce that its disruption, even temporary disruption, would cascade through supply chains on 6 continents within 72 hours. Tankers carrying liquefied natural gas, container ships stacked with manufactured goods, bulk carriers loaded with grain, naval vessels on deployment rotations, all of them pass through the same bottleneck, all of them submit to the same operational parameters, all of them depend on infrastructure they do not own, maintained by a government they do not elect, operated according to terms they did not negotiate. Panama. The name appears in shipping manifests, transit schedules, and route optimization software. It appears without fanfare, without explanation. A waypoint, a coordinate, a necessary passage embedded so deeply in the architecture of global trade that its presence is assumed rather than questioned. But assumptions, particularly assumptions about critical infrastructure, have a way of becoming vulnerabilities when circumstances shift. Sharp in tone, the United States moves approximately 70% of its containerized cargo between the east and west coasts through this passage. American liquefied natural gas exports to Asia depend on it. Military sea-lift commands route vessels through it. Strategic calculations about response times, deployment windows, and logistical reach all incorporate the assumption of access. Uninterrupted access, reliable access, access on terms that do not change unpredictably. But terms do change. Over recent years, not decades in the abstract, but measurable recent years, patterns have emerged that some observers describe as repositioning. Chinese state-affiliated enterprises have acquired terminal operations at both Atlantic and Pacific entry points. Port infrastructure investments have arrived from sources that traditionally did not participate in Western Hemisphere logistics. Container traffic patterns have shifted in ways that correlate with broader geopolitical realignments. None of this is covert. None of this violates agreements. It is simply happening in the methodical, incremental manner that characterizes infrastructure investment. And infrastructure investment, unlike military deployment or diplomatic confrontation, does not trigger immediate responses. It accumulates quietly, creating new operational realities that only become visible when viewed across extended time frames. Donald Trump. The name functions here not as a political identity but as a conceptual framework, a lens through which strategic assets are evaluated not by their historical status but by their current utility. This perspective does not prioritize diplomatic continuity. This perspective does not prioritize diplomatic continuity. It does not defer to established norms about sovereignty and non-interference. It asks a simpler, more direct question. Does the current arrangement serve American interests optimally, or does it represent an inherited assumption that should be reconsidered? That question, once asked, does not disappear. It persists. It circulates through policy discussions, strategic assessments, and the kind of informal conversations where future positions are tested before they become formal proposals. And in those conversations, certain phrases begin to appear. References to taking back control, allusions to unfair arrangements, suggestions that we built it, we should benefit from it more directly. These are not policy statements, these are signals. They function as trial balloons, introducing concepts into public discourse to gauge reaction, to normalize previously unthinkable positions, to shift the boundaries of acceptable discussion. Some analysts quietly suggest that this process is deliberate, that remarks made in passing during rallies or interviews are not rhetorical excess, but carefully calibrated messaging designed to prepare public opinion for future initiatives. Consider the sequence: casual comments about the canal, media coverage analyzing those comments, think tank papers exploring historical precedents for infrastructure renegotiation, congressional inquiries about Chinese influence in Central American ports. None of these elements alone constitutes evidence of coordinated strategy, but viewed as a pattern, they suggest something more structured than coincidence. This sequence invites speculation, controlled speculation, not conspiracy, but the acknowledgement that power operates through preparation as much as through action. The possibility emerges that certain strategic thinkers view infrastructure control not as a territorial question but as a management question, that influence over transit routes could be more valuable than ownership of the surrounding land. That leverage exists not in occupation but in the capacity to shape terms of access. Some suggest, and again this remains in the realm of informed speculation rather than documented policy, that future arrangements could involve joint operational frameworks, security partnerships justified through the language of hemispheric stability and counter-narcotics cooperation, infrastructure modernization agreements that gradually shift decision-making authority, economic pressure applied not through sanctions but through alternative route development, through investment redirection, through the quiet suggestion that current terms are negotiable. Panama does not project military power. It does not possess the naval assets to secure its own waterway against external pressure. It does not have the economic scale to resist sustained leverage from larger powers. This asymmetry is not secret. It is simply a condition of geography and capacity, and conditions like these tend to attract attention from states that think in terms of strategic contingencies. There is no evidence of invasion planning. There is no evidence of covert destabilization, but there is evidence of increased scrutiny, of naval presence adjustments in the region, of procurement patterns suggesting enhanced readiness for operations in tropical maritime environments, of language used in strategic documents shifting from cooperation with Panama to ensuring reliable canal access. This language does not threaten. It does not need to. It simply establishes a framework in which certain outcomes begin to seem more rational than others, in which questions about who should manage critical global infrastructure start to sound less like violations of sovereignty and more like reasonable discussions about efficiency and security. Alternative routes exist, theoretically, the Northwest Passage through the Arctic slowly becoming navigable as ice coverage diminishes, the Suez Canal, though it serves different geographic markets, proposed land bridges across South America, though none have achieved operational scale. But alternatives do not eliminate dependence, they redistribute it. And redistribution in strategic terms simply means the vulnerability moves rather than disappears. The question is not whether the passage matters. Everyone agrees it matters. The question is whether those who depend on it most are willing to accept management by a state that does not share their strategic priorities, that increasingly operates within a different geopolitical orbit, that makes decisions based on considerations that may not align with American interests. Some observers point to historical precedents. The Panama Canal operated under American control for most of the 20th century. Treaties transferred sovereignty in 1977, with full Panamanian control established in 1999. But treaties are not immutable. They are subject to reinterpretation when circumstances change, and circumstances from a certain perspective have changed considerably. The rise of China as a commercial and strategic competitor, the increasing importance of maritime choke points in great power competition, the recognition that control over infrastructure can confer influence without requiring territorial expansion. These shifts create space for arguments that once would have seemed absurd, arguments that existing arrangements no longer serve contemporary realities, that renegotiation is not aggressive but prudent. This is not prediction. This is pattern observation. The observation that when attention accumulates without crisis, it often signals preparation rather than reaction. That when language shifts from operational to strategic, when casual remarks become talking points, when think tank discussions begin to converge on similar themes, something is being considered. Not decided, not announced, not implemented, simply considered. And consideration, given sufficient time and pressure, has a way of becoming policy. particularly when the policy involves infrastructure that cannot defend itself, managed by a state that cannot resist sustained leverage, in a region where American influence has historically been decisive. Panama does not set the agenda for these discussions. It responds to them. It attempts to navigate between competing pressures, maintaining sovereignty while accommodating concerns from its largest customer, managing Chinese investment while not provoking American alarm, asserting independence while remaining acutely aware of its limited options. But response is not agency, and navigation is not control. Agency concentrates in the hands of those who can project force, apply economic pressure, or simply wait until circumstances create opportunities for renegotiation on more favorable terms. Waiting is not passivity. Waiting is strategic patience. It allows narratives to develop. It allows public opinion to adjust to ideas that initially seem extreme. It allows the Overton window to shift so that proposals once considered unthinkable become debatable, and proposals once considered debatable become reasonable, and once something becomes reasonable in strategic discourse, it becomes operational in planning documents, and once it appears in planning documents, it becomes a contingency that requires preparation. And once preparation begins, the gap between contingency and policy narrows considerably. There is no ultimatum prepared. There is no invasion timeline. There is no declared intent to alter the status quo through force. But there is scrutiny. There is positioning. There is the quiet recalibration of how strategic assets are valued and whether their current management serves long-term national interests. And recalibration, in the context of infrastructure this critical, rarely remains purely theoretical, because infrastructure, unlike territory, does not require conquest. It requires management, and management can change through mechanisms far subtler than military force, through economic agreements, through security partnerships, through the gradual accumulation of leverage that makes renegotiation seem preferable to resistance. This is the nature of modern strategic competition, not the overt confrontation of previous eras, but the quiet repositioning around assets that shape the terms of global commerce. The recognition that whoever controls the flow controls more than just the route. They control timing, they control costs, they control the entire calculation of what is feasible and what is not. Panama, then, is not a target in any conventional sense. It is not a problem to be solved through force. It is a signal, a narrow passage that reveals how contemporary power thinks and operates, how leverage accumulates in the absence of dramatic announcements, how infrastructure, unglamorous, technical, easily overlooked infrastructure becomes the terrain on which future influence is negotiated. The vessels continue to queue, the passage continues to function, transit fees are paid, schedules are maintained, and global commerce flows through this 48-mile corridor, as it has for over a century. And somewhere, in offices far from the waterway itself, calculations continue. Not calculations about war, not calculations about conquest, calculations about control, about access, about who decides the terms under which movement occurs, about whether those terms, established decades ago under different geopolitical conditions, still serve contemporary strategic requirements. And that decision, quiet, technical, invisible to most observers, shapes more than shipping schedules. It shapes the fundamental terms on which power flows in an interconnected world, without announcement, without resolution, without end. Because in geopolitics, unlike in war, there are no final victories. There are only positions. There are only adjustments. There are only the endless calculations of how to maximize leverage over assets that matter, conducted in language that sounds technical but masks intentions that are purely strategic. Panama waits, the canal operates, the ships transit, and power, as it always does, continues to think several moves ahead, not in the language of confrontation, but in the language of management, not in the rhetoric of dominance, but in the quiet recalibration of what reasonable arrangements should look like when circumstances change. The passage remains, the questions persist, and the distance between speculation and policy continues to narrow, one quiet conversation at a time.